The wind rolled across the abandoned dunes of Dunkirk like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter scent of smoke, sea salt, and the fading echoes of artillery beyond the horizon. In this desolate stretch of coast, where the world seemed suspended between survival and oblivion, a lone British medic named Thomas Elwood pushed forward through the soft, treacherous sand, his boots torn, his uniform stained with dust and dried blood that was not entirely his own. The battlefield behind him had dissolved into a haze of fire and screams. Yet ahead lay a silence so profound it felt almost sacrilegious, as if the war itself paused to witness what a single man would choose to do when all supply lines, all commands, all hope had fractured. Elwood carried no bandages, no morphine, no instruments beyond a rusted pair of scissors and his own trembling resolve. Yet his heart throbbed with an unspoken oath older than any regiment's creed, compelling him deeper into the ruins scattered across the shoreline. At the edge of the dunes, he found the first group of wounded. Men sprawled inside the skeletal remains of what once had been a loading shack, their bodies twisted in pain, their faces pale beneath the flickering beams of daylight that slipped through shattered wooden slats. Some tried calling out, but their voices broke into hoarse whispers, while others lay motionless, drifting between life and whatever cold frontier lay beyond it. Elwood paused only a moment, swallowing the rising surge of fear that threatened to choke him, before kneeling beside the nearest soldier, a boy whose freckles were still visible beneath streaks of soot. With no supplies, no antiseptic, no compresses, Elwood tore strips from his own shirt, pressing them into the wounds he could reach, whispering fragments of comfort he did not entirely believe as he worked with feverish improvisation. The world around him reduced to pulse and breath, and the fragile warmth beneath his palms, forcing him to move from one man to the next, performing a brutal form of triage guided solely by instinct and the faint glow of life he refused to let extinguish. Outside, the tide clawed its slow ascent toward the ruins, its waves churning with oil and debris from wrecked vessels that dotted the distant horizon like tombstones. Each low rumble of the sea seemed to echo the far-off drone of enemy aircraft, but Elwood forced his mind to focus only on the immediate tasks before him, the fractures that needed splinting with scavenged planks, the bleeding that demanded pressure from his bare hands, the shallow breaths that needed coaxing back from the brink. He worked without rest, moving through the shack and then beyond it into a cluster of craters, where more wounded lay scattered like remnants of a broken constellation. He learned their names when they were conscious enough to speak, storing each one like a sacred vow. Among them were men from regiments he had never heard of, Scots with torn kilts stiffened by mud, engineers burned raw by exploding fuel lines, and a French corporal whose leg had been crushed beneath a fallen beam, yet who insisted Elwood treat everyone else first with a defiant pride that masked a dying man's terror. Hours bled into one another. The sun crawled its relentless path across the sky, throwing long shadows that stretched over bodies Elwood had managed to stabilize and those he had not. He found water in dented canteens, abandoned on the beach, and used it sparingly, moistening lips, cleaning wounds as best he could before resorting again to torn cloth and whispered assurances. His hands shook from exhaustion, but he refused to acknowledge the ache creeping through his limbs, the dryness in his throat, the tremor in his voice when he urged a soldier to hold on just a little longer. This patch of ravaged coastline became his world, a narrow corridor between destruction and deliverance, where the notion of defeat lost its meaning, replaced by the fierce determination to keep breathing men alive until someone, anyone, returned for them. As twilight began to settle, painting the dunes with bruised hues of blue and violet, Elwood finally stepped back to survey the group he had gathered in a makeshift sanctuary of tarpaulin scraps and driftwood. 100 wounded souls under his care, 100 lives clinging to the fragile thread he was desperately trying to maintain. Yet in that descending darkness, amid the distant thunder of approaching bombardment, Elwood felt a strange stillness settle upon him, a quiet that came not from surrender, but from the realization of his own humanity stretched to its limit and somehow still holding. He knew dawn would bring new trials, perhaps even death, but for now, He remained anchored by the simple, unwavering truth that he had done all he could with nothing but his bare hands and the relentless beat of his heart. Dunkirk might have been a place of abandonment, but within this narrow pocket of ruin, it had also become a testament to the endurance of compassion when stripped of all protection, all recognition, all certainty of survival. Night fell upon Dunkirk like a shroud of ash. The fires from the harbour flickered faintly in the distance, illuminating the smoke that crawled across the horizon like a living ghost. Thomas Elwood crouched beside his makeshift shelter, listening to the uneven symphony of breathing around him. 100 wounded men clinging to life through sheer defiance. The sound was broken by occasional moans, whispered prayers, and the hollow crash of waves against the nearby hulls of wrecked boats. Each sound carved deeper into his exhaustion, but he did not allow sleep to come. Not yet. His eyes, dry and red from sand and sleeplessness, drifted between the faces illuminated by the dim glow of a broken lantern he had scavenged earlier. These were not soldiers anymore. They were fragments of humanity, stripped of rank, stripped of nationality, bound together by pain, by need, by the fragile will to live. He moved silently through the camp, checking pulses, adjusting the crude bandages that were already soaked through with blood and seawater. The night air was cold, sharp with the scent of burning oil, and Elwood's hands had grown numb long ago. He found himself murmuring softly to a man who had lost his leg, the stump bound in strips of uniform fabric darkened to near black. The soldier's eyes opened weakly, glazed with fever, yet he managed a faint smile as Elwood reassured him that rescue would come. It was a lie, or at least it felt like one. No one had returned to this sector in 2 days. The evacuation fleet had moved farther west, beyond the reach of the German artillery now creeping ever closer. The sounds of battle had grown distant, muffled by the sea wind, and Elwood knew what that meant. They had been forgotten. Still, he refused to abandon them. Hope, however fragile, was a duty in itself. In the small hours before dawn, a light rain began to fall, mixing with soot and turning the sand into dark streaks of mud. Elwood tilted his head back to the sky, letting the water run down his face, cleansing the sweat and grime from his brow. He filled a few empty tins with the precious rainwater, passing it carefully among the men who could still drink. One soldier, delirious with infection, called him father, mistaking his silhouette for someone else. Elwood did not correct him. He only pressed a wet cloth to the man's forehead and whispered, "Rest now, son. The sea will be kind tonight." It was all he had left to give, the illusion of safety in a place long stripped of it. When morning broke, the grey light revealed the true state of his labour. The wounded had multiplied. During the night, more had crawled in from the dunes, stragglers, burned and half-conscious, drawn by the faint promise of shelter. Some had followed the faint flicker of his lantern through the smoke. Others had simply collapsed within sight of it. Elwood counted them with a heavy heart. He was now tending to well over 100 men. His medical knowledge, once a tool of order and procedure, had turned into an act of faith. He sterilized wounds by rinsing them in seawater, knowing it would cause agony but save lives. He used rifle barrels as splints, shoelaces as sutures, sandbags as pillows. Each gesture was a rebellion against despair. The hours blurred. Elwood's mind began to drift between reality and fever, between the here and the elsewhere, between Dunkirk and home. He thought of his wife, Margaret, waiting in Sussex with their newborn son, whose eyes he had seen only once before being shipped to France. He imagined her reading the casualty lists in the paper, searching for his name, wondering if he was among the thousands stranded on this cursed shore. The thought stabbed him with both grief and strength. If he could not leave, he would at least make his being here mean something. For every man who drew another breath under his care, he found a fragment of redemption. For every pulse that faded despite his efforts, he whispered a prayer to no god in particular, but to the sea itself, the only witness left to his vow. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again with the threat of another bombardment. Distant thunder rolled, though it was not thunder. Elwood looked out toward the water and saw black dots forming in the air. Aircraft, moving like insects against the grey expanse. He shouted for the men who could still move to take cover under what little protection remained. The wounded cried out as the first bombs began to fall, shaking the sand, splintering driftwood, sending shards of glass through the air. The roar of explosions was deafening, but Elwood threw himself over the nearest man, shielding him with his body as the ground convulsed beneath them. For a moment, the world became nothing but light, fire, and the sharp metallic taste of dust and fear. When the noise finally faded, Elwood lifted his head, ears ringing, and realized he was still alive. The man beneath him was breathing too, shallow but steady. Around them, the shelter lay in ruins. The rain returned, falling softly through the smoke, hissing over the smouldering wreckage as if the heavens themselves sought to soothe what men had destroyed. If you're feeling the emotion of Elwood's struggle so far, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Your place in the world matters to this story. Dawn came reluctantly, as if even the sun hesitated to return to Dunkirk. The horizon bled in shades of dull red and grey, and the wind carried the acrid smell of fuel and decay. Elwood stood among the ruins, his coat soaked through from the night's rain, his boots caked with mud and blood that no longer washed away. Around him, men groaned softly, the air filled with the low hum of suffering that had become his constant companion. The bombardment had taken more lives than he dared count. He knelt beside each fallen soldier in silence, closing their eyes with hands that trembled not from fear, but from fatigue so profound it felt carved into his bones. His lips moved soundlessly, reciting the same words over and over, a prayer, a promise, or perhaps an apology. By mid-morning, the rain ceased, and a pale light revealed the devastation in full. The tarpaulins were shredded, supplies non-existent, and yet Elwood's will remained intact, fragile but unbroken. He found a moment to sit by a broken beam, his back to the cold wind, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe without purpose. His thoughts drifted again to home. He could almost see Margaret standing by the window of their small cottage, the child in her arms, the fields behind her swaying in the English sun. The vision struck him like a cruel mirage. He blinked it away and forced his gaze back to the men before him, his temporary family, his fragile congregation of the lost. A distant explosion snapped him from reverie. He rose at once, scanning the beach. Far off, a plume of black smoke climbed into the sky. Another ship struck. Through the haze, he could make out small figures on the shore, hundreds of them moving like shadows toward the water. The evacuation was still underway. Hope surged briefly in his chest, but it was quickly tempered by reality. His sector was cut off, surrounded by debris and shallow craters. They would not be reached soon, if at all. And yet, somewhere inside him, a voice whispered that he must prepare, must believe that the sea might still deliver salvation. Driven by that fragile belief, Elwood set to work once more. He gathered what materials he could find, a length of fishing net, shards of mirror from a shattered signal lamp, a rusted bucket, and began constructing a signal post atop the nearest dune. Each movement was slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. When at last he managed to angle the mirror toward the horizon, he caught the faint glimmer of sunlight, reflecting it in rhythmic flashes toward the sea. Morse code, half remembered from his early training, emerged from muscle memory. Help. Wounded. Alive. He repeated it again and again until his arm felt like lead, the light cutting through the drifting smoke like a desperate heartbeat. Back below, one of the wounded stirred. A young French soldier whose arm had been splintered with a plank and bound with a strip of uniform. His face was gaunt, eyes fever-bright. "Do you think they will come?" he asked weakly, his accent softened by exhaustion. Elwood knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, though his heart trembled. "Someone will come." The lie tasted less like deceit now, and more like duty. To give up hope here would be to bury them all before the sea did. The day wore on, the air growing heavy with heat and tension. Elwood moved among the wounded, checking dressings, distributing the last of the rainwater. Each act became slower, every motion labored. His mind drifted between moments. The chaos of the retreat through the town, the shouts of officers as they ordered medics to fall back, the flash of gunfire through the mist, and his own decision to stay. He had not thought of it as bravery then. It had been instinct, the same instinct that now compelled him to keep moving when every nerve screamed for rest. He remembered the faces of the men he'd treated in the first days, those who had begged him to go, who had cursed him for staying. Most were gone now. The beach had become a graveyard of uniforms and unspoken stories. In the afternoon, a faint hum broke the monotony of silence. Elwood lifted his head, heart pounding. Aircraft again, but this time different. The pitch of their engines was lighter, higher, familiar. He stumbled to the edge of the dunes, squinting into the glare of the sea. There, low over the water, came a formation of planes marked with roundels, British, unmistakably. Relief flooded him so suddenly he nearly fell to his knees. They weren't bombers, they were fighters escorting something below. Small boats, dozens of them, cutting through the waves like a fleet of silver fish. The rescue flotilla. The miracle of Dunkirk had returned. Elwood turned, shouting hoarsely to the men, his voice cracking with disbelief and joy. "They're coming! Hold on, lads! They're coming!" Those who could move lifted their heads, eyes widening, hands reaching weakly toward the horizon. Some wept, others simply stared in silence, too drained to react. Elwood scrambled down the slope, gathering his meager belongings, waving a makeshift flag torn from his tunic. The boats grew larger with each passing minute, the sound of their engines blending with the surf and the faint cries of men rediscovering hope. It was then that Elwood noticed movement along the cliffs beyond, a dark glint of metal, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. The Germans had seen them too. Bullets tore through the sand, cutting through the shouts and laughter in a single instant. Elwood threw himself flat, shielding the nearest wounded man, the joy in his chest collapsing into raw, focused terror. The evacuation would not come easily. The battle for this last pocket of survival had only just begun. If this moment of desperate hope and renewed danger gripped you, please subscribe to follow Elwood's story. Every act of courage deserves to be remembered. The horizon, once a faint promise of salvation, erupted into a storm of fire and noise. The small boats that had appeared like deliverance moments before were now under siege. German artillery from the cliffs tore the sea apart, sending geysers of salt and flame into the air. Elwood watched in horror as one of the vessels burst into pieces, the sound of splintering wood and shattering lives mingling with the roar of engines and the screams of drowning men. The miracle of Dunkirk had arrived, but it came through hellfire. He sprinted down the beach, stumbling across the uneven sand, shouting over the chaos for anyone who could still move to help. A few soldiers, half-bandaged and limping, followed him with whatever strength remained. Together, they dragged the wounded toward the shoreline, hauling stretchers made from doors and rifle slings, their boots slipping in pools of blackened seawater. The tide had turned, and with it came the stench of oil, death, and burning cordite. Overhead, Spitfires dove and twisted in the sky, their machine guns spitting tracers that vanished into the smoke. For brief moments, Elwood caught sight of them silhouetted against the sun, metallic angels battling over the inferno below. He reached the first wave of boats, shouting to the sailors and fishermen who manned them. "We've got wounded! Dozens!" he cried, his voice raw. The men on the boats, civilians in oilskins, soldiers with hollow eyes, nodded grimly and threw ropes ashore. Elwood waded into the surf, the icy water biting into his legs, clutching one rope as he guided the first stretcher forward. Bullets snapped overhead, striking the water with vicious precision. He ignored them. Every breath was a gamble, every step an act of defiance against the cold logic of death. When they finally loaded the first wounded man onto a boat, Elwood felt a surge of triumph cut through his exhaustion. It was working. They were getting out. But the illusion didn't last. Another explosion rocked the beach, tearing through a nearby group of soldiers who had been waiting for their turn to board. The shockwave threw Elwood backward, his vision blurring as sand and shrapnel rained down. He coughed violently, tasting blood, his ears ringing so loudly that for a moment he heard nothing else. No cries, no engines, only the deep, hollow silence that follows catastrophe. When his hearing returned, it came with the sound of someone calling his name. He turned and saw Sergeant Weller, his leg bound in strips of webbing, waving him down from a crater. "Medic! We've got more incoming from the east!" Weller shouted, pointing toward the dunes. There, through the smoke, Elwood saw figures advancing. German soldiers moving cautiously along the ridge, rifles glinting in the sunlight. Panic rippled through the wounded as realization spread. The enemy was closing in. Elwood's mind raced. The rescue boats would be forced to pull back soon under heavy fire. If he didn't move the remaining wounded now, they'd be left behind again, left to whatever mercy the enemy would not offer. He knelt beside Weller, gripping his shoulder. "We have to hold them off until the last boat's loaded," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Weller nodded grimly and handed him a rifle. "You know how to use it?" the sergeant asked. Elwood looked down at the weapon, its metal cold and unfamiliar in his hands. "I'm a medic," he said quietly, then chambered a round. "But I'll try." What followed was a blur of smoke, chaos, and desperate courage. Elwood took position beside the crater, firing not with precision, but with purpose. To buy moments, seconds, anything that might allow another life to be carried to safety. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, the recoil jarring through muscles already screaming with fatigue. Around him, men fought and fell. The air filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and salt. The cries of the wounded drowned beneath the thunder of bombardment. Every time a boat pushed off from shore, Elwood turned to drag another stretcher through the sand, his hands raw and bleeding, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Hours passed in fragments, flashes of sunlight through smoke, the silhouettes of men wading into the sea, the haunting whistle of shells overhead. By late afternoon, the boats were nearly gone, retreating with their human cargo into the relative safety of the channel. Only a handful remained on the beach, clustered near the ruined shack where Elwood had first found his patients days before. He limped back toward it, his body screaming for rest, and found a small group of wounded still waiting. The French corporal, the young boy with freckles, and two others who were too weak to stand. His heart broke at the sight. The last boat signaled from the water. They could take no more. The sea was rising, and the Germans were nearly upon them. Elwood looked between the wounded and the retreating vessel, his mind warring between duty and survival. Every rational thought urged him to run, to live, to escape this doomed beach. But the oath that had kept him here all along still pulsed in his chest, louder than the guns. He turned to the corporal, whose lips trembled with pain. "Go," the Frenchman whispered, understanding. "You've done enough." Elwood shook his head slowly. "No," he said, kneeling beside him. "Not yet." He dragged what remained of the shelter closer to them, using planks and tarpaulins to form a rough barricade against the wind and debris. The boat faded into the distance, a speck swallowed by mist. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Elwood found himself alone again with the dying light, the wounded, and the endless rhythm of the tide. Dunkirk had emptied, leaving him behind with those too broken to be saved. And yet he did not feel abandoned. He felt necessary. That night, as tracer fire streaked across the sky and the surf whispered against the shore, Thomas Elwood bound one last wound, pressed one last hand, and whispered one last prayer. Not for rescue now, but for peace, for himself, for the men beside him, and for a world that had forgotten them. The night pressed down upon Dunkirk like a weight, heavy and suffocating. The last echoes of battle faded into the distance. leaving behind only the sound of the wind moving through the ruins and the eternal breathing of the sea. The fires that had once illuminated the horizon were dying, reduced to faint glows that flickered like the last memories of a vanished world. Thomas Elwood sat on the damp sand beside his makeshift barricade, his back against a piece of driftwood, the remnants of his uniform stiff with salt and blood. The men who remained with him, 7 in total now, lay in uneasy silence, their faces half lit by the dim moonlight. Some murmured in delirium, others slept in shallow, tremulous breaths. None asked when help would come any more. They knew, as Elwood knew, that no help was coming. He moved among them slowly, methodically, guided more by instinct than consciousness. His mind had become something distant and detached, watching from a place beyond exhaustion. He changed the cloths on wounds that no longer bled, checked pulses that had begun to fade into stillness, whispered comfort to men whose eyes stared past him into some unreachable distance. The air was bitterly cold, but he no longer felt it. His hands had lost sensation long ago, yet they still worked, still touched, still soothed. In the silence of the abandoned beach, the act of care itself had become his last form of prayer. A soft groan drew his attention. The young soldier with freckles, the one he had found in the loading shack on that first day, was awake, his lips cracked, his eyes unfocused. Elwood knelt beside him, brushing away the sand that had gathered in his hair. The boy tried to speak, but no words came, only the faint whisper of air. Elwood pressed a water-soaked rag to his lips, though there was barely a drop left. "Rest," he said quietly, though his own voice was more ghost than sound. The boy blinked slowly, his gaze fixed on the sky. "Are we going home?" he asked at last, the words broken but clear. Elwood hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Home." The boy smiled faintly before his eyes slipped shut again. The question answered. The journey ended. Elwood sat there for a long moment, the sea whispering around him, before closing the boy's eyes and drawing a blanket over him. Hours passed. The tide crept closer. The line between sea and sky dissolved into a single misty expanse. Elwood rose unsteadily, every joint stiff, every movement slow. His body had become a ruin, but his mind, though battered, remained stubbornly alive. He walked to the edge of the surf and stared out across the dark water. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay England, that distant sanctuary of memory and promise. He tried to picture the green hills, the quiet lanes, the light falling through the kitchen window where Margaret once stood. But the image would not stay. It dissolved into the mist, replaced by the faces of the men around him. Every soldier he had treated, every soul he had tried to save. Their names pressed at the edge of his mind like a litany. He began to whisper them, one by one, letting the sound merge with the wind, the waves, the crackling of dying fires. It was as if by speaking their names aloud, he could anchor them to the world a little longer, keep them from being swallowed by oblivion. Behind him, a cough broke the silence. The French corporal was awake, his face pale but determined. "You should go," he rasped. "Take the sea, find a boat." Elwood turned and shook his head. "There are no boats left," he said softly. "Only the sea." The corporal gave a tired smile. "Then go into it," he murmured. "Better that than the enemy's mercy." Elwood knelt beside him and took his hand. "And leave you?" he asked. "No, I've come too far to run now." The Frenchman's eyes closed slowly, a faint nod marking the end of their conversation. Elwood sat with him until his breathing stilled, then pulled a tattered flag, half British, half French, from the sand and draped it over his chest. 2 nations, 2 men, 1 silence. The first light of dawn began to seep through the mist. It was weak and colourless, yet it brought with it a strange tranquility. Elwood looked up and saw, for the first time in days, a sky free of aircraft. The bombardment had stopped. The world had grown quiet, eerily so. He could hear only the steady rhythm of the tide, the distant cries of gulls, and the beating of his own heart. He realized then that he was the last one awake. The others had all drifted away, carried by sleep or death. He could no longer tell which. He sat there in the sand, his knees drawn to his chest, staring at the horizon. The sea shimmered faintly, and in its reflection he thought he saw movement, small shapes gliding across the water. He blinked, uncertain if it was real or the delirium of exhaustion. But as the light strengthened, the shapes grew clearer. Boats, real boats, civilian craft, their hulls painted in bright ordinary colors, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, tugs, moving steadily toward the shore. Elwood rose, swaying, his vision swimming. He took a step forward, then another, his feet sinking into the wet sand. He raised one arm and waved weakly, shouting until his voice cracked. They were coming. Again. As the boats drew closer, a group of men jumped into the surf, splashing toward him. He could hear their voices now, calling out, shouting for survivors. The sound struck him like sunlight through clouds. He laughed, a raw, broken sound, and stumbled toward them. But as he moved, the world began to tilt, his knees giving way beneath him. The last thing he felt was the cool touch of seawater against his face and the faint pressure of hands lifting him up, voices shouting his name through the roar of the wind. Then darkness. It was the darkness of rest, not death. For the first time in days, Thomas Elwood allowed himself to surrender, not to despair, but to the peace he had earned. When Thomas Elwood opened his eyes, the world had changed. The sky above him was pale and still, washed in the muted gold of an English morning. For a long moment, he could not comprehend where he was. The air no longer smelled of smoke and salt. The sound of the sea was distant, almost gentle, and the ground beneath him did not shift with the restless tide. He blinked slowly, his vision clearing to reveal the white ceiling of a hospital tent, the canvas swaying softly in the breeze. The low murmur of voices surrounded him, calm, human voices, and the steady rhythm of footsteps on wooden planks. It took him several breaths to realize that the sound he heard, faint but unmistakable, was birdsong. He tried to sit up, but pain lanced through his body, forcing him back. A nurse appeared almost immediately, her face kind but lined with fatigue. "Easy," she said softly, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "You're safe now, sir. You're in Dover." Dover. The word hung in his mind like a fragment of dream. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his lips cracked. The nurse poured water into a tin cup and held it to his mouth. The coolness of it made him tremble. He drank slowly, his mind still lost between worlds. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough, barely above a whisper. The men. The wounded. The nurse's expression faltered for just an instant, enough for Elwood to understand. "You were found alone," she said gently. "Drifted in with the tide on a lifeboat. They said it was a miracle you were alive." Elwood stared at her, the words passing through him without sound. Alone. The meaning of it pressed against his chest like a weight. He turned his head toward the tent's open flap. Outside, rows of cots stretched into the distance, filled with men wrapped in blankets, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Beyond them, the cliffs of Dover rose against the morning sky, white and indifferent. Home, he thought, but it didn't feel like home. Days passed in a haze of recovery. His wounds were tended to, his fever treated, his hands cleaned of blood that seemed to have sunk into his skin forever. The nurses moved quietly, their kindness efficient, practiced. He learned to walk again, slowly, leaning on a cane made from a piece of driftwood. At night, when the ward grew quiet and the oil lamps flickered low, the memories returned. The crash of waves against the burning shore, the cries of the dying, the metallic taste of salt and smoke. He would wake gasping, his heart pounding, his mind still trapped on that beach. Sometimes he thought he could hear them calling for him, the men he had left behind, the ones whose names he had whispered to the sea. Their voices came not as accusations, but as echoes of unfinished prayers. One morning, a young officer came to speak with him. He introduced himself as Captain Reed, part of the evacuation command. He thanked Elwood for his service, told him his actions had been noted at the highest level. The phrasing struck Elwood as absurdly cold. The captain read from a paper, "For exceptional bravery in tending to over 100 wounded men under enemy fire, and for remaining voluntarily behind during the evacuation, Sergeant Thomas Elwood is to be commended." When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "They're recommending you for the Military Cross," he said. Elwood only nodded. The medal meant nothing. How could metal replace the faces that haunted him, the hands that had gone limp in his grasp? He thanked the officer quietly and asked to be left alone. Later that day, as the sun dipped low beyond the white cliffs, Elwood stood at the edge of the harbour. He leaned heavily on his cane, the salt air brushing against his face. The sea stretched before him, vast and calm, its surface glinting with the same deceptive serenity that had hidden so much death. In the distance, ships moved like shadows, carrying survivors to ports farther inland. He could hear the faint murmur of waves striking the docks, a rhythm that reminded him too much of Dunkirk's dying heartbeat. He thought of the young soldier with freckles, the French corporal, Sergeant Weller, and all the nameless ones who had lain in the sand with him, their hope anchored in his hands. He whispered their names once more, letting the sound be carried away by the wind. When he finally turned from the sea, he did so not as a man healed, but as one who had learned the cost of compassion, the weight of remembering when the world preferred to forget. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one a return and a farewell. Years passed, yet the sea never left him. It lived in the rhythm of his breath, in the muted sound of wind brushing the fields outside his home, in the way he sometimes woke before dawn and felt the taste of salt on his tongue. The war had ended, but peace was not a thing he could hold. It came and went like the tide, gentle at times, cruel at others, and always retreating before he could grasp it fully. Thomas Elwood lived quietly in Sussex, in a small cottage overlooking the hills. The world around him rebuilt itself. Cities rose from ruins, children laughed in streets where silence once reigned, and the word victory filled the newspapers as if it could erase what had been lost. But Elwood carried the war differently. It was not a wound anymore, nor even a memory. It was a companion, a shadow that stood beside him each morning when he looked out toward the sea. He spent his days tending a modest garden, his hands forever marked by the stains of another life. He did not speak often of Dunkirk. When neighbours asked, he would smile faintly and say it was a long time ago, though sometimes his voice would falter on the last word. The village children liked him, the quiet man who carved small wooden boats and set them afloat in the stream behind his home. He told them they carried wishes, not soldiers, though in truth every one of them carried a name. Margaret aged gracefully beside him, her presence the steady light that anchored him to the world. Their son grew into a man, tall and thoughtful, wearing his father's gentleness like an inheritance. It was through them that Elwood rediscovered fragments of hope, not the roaring kind that drives men into battle, but the fragile, enduring kind that grows in silence, in tenderness, in the simple act of continuing. Yet even in this peace, the ghosts of Dunkirk lingered. Some nights, when the wind came from the east, carrying the scent of the Channel, Elwood would walk alone to the cliffs and watch the waves break below. He never spoke during those vigils, but Margaret knew better than to follow. The sea was speaking to him, and he was listening. In 1950, a letter arrived from France. It was written in careful English by a young man named Henri. The son of the French Corporal Elwood had stayed beside until the end. Henry had found Elwood's name in an archive and wished to thank him. "My father died on that beach," he wrote, but his last words were of a British medic who refused to leave him. "My family owes you our peace." Elwood read the letter several times before placing it in a drawer beside his medals, which he had never worn. That night, he returned to the cliffs and watched the horizon fade into dusk. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to weep, not for sorrow, but for the unbearable grace of being remembered. As the years drew on, Elwood's strength waned, but his eyes never lost that distant, searching light. On his final evening, the air was calm and the sea quiet. He sat by the window, watching the world dissolve into twilight. Margaret sat beside him, her hand resting over his. "You're far away again," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "No," he said, "I'm home." When dawn came, the house was still. The morning light fell across his chair, across the wooden models on the shelf, across a single folded paper on the table, Henri's letter, worn at the edges, beside a note in Elwood's own hand. For the men on the beach, we were all one heartbeat once. And so the tide went on, carrying his story into the silence of history, into the salt and wind of Dunkirk, where the sea remembers what men try to forget.